Welcome to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm going to be talking with writer and producer Alan Katz. He has a lot of credits in both television and features, including being a co-producer and writer on the groundbreaking HBO series Tales from the Crypt. We're going to be talking about Breaking Bad and some of the lessons that writers can learn from this very well-written show. He's been in the business for years and really has some great information to share with us. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a like and leave a comment. I want to improve this podcast, so some honest, constructive feedback is very much appreciated. Please also share this podcast episode with anyone who you think could get some value out of it. I'd like to thank a few people who posted some nice comments on YouTube. So thank you, Stefan SE9, Eric Joyce, Max K, Ginger Shine, Ronnie Uberith, and the Old Family Movies channel. Max asked about the quality of the sound in the interview from last episode. I'm still working on figuring out the best way to record an interview. Hopefully this week's will be a little bit better. These sorts of comments are very important to me as they help me make this podcast better. So really don't hesitate to tell me if you see any problems. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts. Also, if you want to get my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. Also, in the last episode of the podcast, I mentioned that I would be interviewing producer Mark Heidelberger. Mark has been busy working on a project and we couldn't quite connect this past week, but I will have him on in a future episode, which is hopefully the next episode. Mark has a lot of experience in both producing and script development, so I think we'll all learn a lot from him. So keep an eye out for that. A quick note about what I'm working on this week. A few episodes ago, I mentioned that I was blasting out my one-location sexy thriller with a female protagonist. Well, I did find a good producer who liked it, and she has optioned it from me. The budget will be well less than $1 million, so I'm not going to make a ton of money from this. But I knew when I wrote this script, it probably wasn't going to be a huge studio film. She mentioned the SAG low-budget agreement, which I think is around $625,000 right now, and it sounds like she's going to try and keep the budget right under that amount. This is something to think about. That SAG low budget agreement is kind of a real threshold for where producers might want to be for a film. And as I said, I think it's around $625,000 now. So if you can write a script that could easily be shot for less than $600,000, it opens up some markets for you. I think this is a pretty good option because the producer is actually the person who goes out and raises the money. Most of the time when I've optioned a script to a director or producer, they don't have a lot of experience raising the money to shoot a film. And raising the money is the hardest part. So with these sorts of independent films, having someone on board who's actually gone out there and raised money before is a great asset. So in any event, a couple of takeaways from this. I specifically wrote this script thinking there was a market for it. I thought long and hard about the marketing of this screenplay, and it seems like my hunch was basically correct, that there is a market for a one-location sexy thriller with a female protagonist. However, just one measly option doesn't really prove anything. It's certainly not statistically significant. I'm planning on writing another similar screenplay once I get a few things off my plate. I will say that overall, I did get some good interest in this script. I actually have a few other people who liked it as well and might have optioned it if I hadn't already optioned it to her. I can say that compared to my baseball comedy, this script got a ton more interest, and I honestly don't think that it's a better screenplay. I think it's just that the market for a sexy thriller is much greater than the market for a baseball comedy. One other thing I want to point out, I've probably had 30 options similar to this one over the course of my career, and you can just go look at my IMDb credits to see how many produced films 30 options has yielded. Suffice it to say, in the vast majority of the cases, the options never amount to anything. So just getting an option really is just a first step. While it's nice, it's nothing to celebrate. I'm not waiting around even for a second for this movie to take off. If it does, great. But in the meantime, I'm working on another spec script and polishing up a script that I wrote a few years ago. So I'll be blasting those two out over the next few months and continuing to try and keep things moving ahead. I also just want to point out that I've had a bit of a lucky streak these past 6 months in optioning a few things and selling one script last month. I'm not going to be able to keep this up. I've certainly had a lot of years where I didn't option anything, and I'm sure I'll have many more lean years in the future too. So I just want to make it clear that these results I've had in the last few months are certainly not typical for me. I do also want to mention that the email and fax blasts that I do for myself and produce this screenplay option is a service that I offer through my website. Just go to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com to learn more about this service. So now let's get into the main segment, which is an interview with producer and writer Alan Katz. Here's the interview.
Welcome to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. Alan, it's great to have you on. I really appreciate you taking some time and coming on and doing this interview.
It's a pleasure to do it, Ashley. It's great to talk to you.
So I guess first, let's just give the listeners sort of a quick overview of your background, how you got into the business, and some of the highlights, some of the things you've worked on during your long career.
Sure. Well, I grew up on the East Coast. I was after college, I was living in New York, not doing much of anything, but I had a friend from high school who'd become she'd become an agent at William Morris, and she said, you should try writing a screenplay. And so I said, okay, I'll try that. So I wrote one, and she liked it. She said, you should try coming out to L.A. and, meet people, see if you like it. And I thought, what a horrible thought. To me, L.A. was the land of the avocado heads. It was just the worst possible place to go to. But I did it. I came out, and people were really, really nice to me, and I went to a bunch of screenings and a premiere or two, and I found myself very quickly getting seduced. And by the third day I was here, it was done. And suddenly I couldn't imagine living in anywhere other than L.A. And I got rather lucky very quickly. I set up one screenplay that a small company put into development. I got hired to do a rewrite on another comedy. I originally started in comedy. And I partnered with this guy who was a very strong producer, and we became a team. And for about 11, 12 years, we were a team. And between the two of us, we got Tales from the Crypt at HBO, and we ran that for a lot of years. And while doing Tales, while being involved with the Crypt partners, who were Joel Silver, Dick Donner, Bob Zemeckis, they were our bosses. We did a couple of feature films, Tales feature films. We did a couple of additional pilots. We did a TV movie for Fox. So it was a great place to be for about the 5-6 years that we were working with the Crypt partners, and I decided to go do something else. And shortly thereafter, I got involved with The Outer Limits and spent 2 years as a co-executive producer there. And then after that, I've been heading into projects that have been rather different and diverse. Right now, I've been working on a project called The Gen X, which is about the Armenian genocide in 1915. Really enjoying the fact that I'm able to go and play in all the different areas where my interests lie, and of course I'm enjoying working with you at present and helping other writers. And one of the things that I've always done along the way is I've always mentored other writers, younger writers, and help get them to that place where they could take their talents and the screenwriting business, the TV writing business, is a very particular thing. And you can be a terrific writer, but a screenplay really has to have two lives. And especially as you're coming into the business, you have to appreciate that it's a sales tool first and foremost. You have to get it into the hands of the people who will be able to move it forward and to possibly even get you paid for the screenplay or to do additional work on the screenplay, or if they like what you've done, to hire you to do other things. And part of how you have to approach the writing of your screenplay is to see that first line of defense, the readers you have to go through, the readers who work for the producers, the readers who work for the studios, the readers who work for the talent agencies. These people are all gatekeepers, and these are people who read dozens of screenplays every week. There's very little that they haven't seen, and they're a very tough, cynical, prickly group of people, and rightfully so, because, like I said, they see a lot of screenplays. The last thing that they want to do is push for a screenplay that their boss is going to read and say, "Why did you make me spend an hour and a half reading this piece of garbage? This is horrible. I don't trust you anymore." So to get those people to say yes so that your screenplay can move past the gatekeeper to the person who could possibly make a decision, it requires a certain amount of appreciation for how you have to write your screenplay, how you have to approach the whole screenwriting process. As I said, you have to worry about not only the technical aspects of what that particular document is, the screenplay, but how to make it the best possible sales tool it can be.
I'm curious. Sure. I'm curious, just to take a step back. One of the things I really like to do on selling your screenplay is break down that sort of process, especially of the selling of the script early on. I'm curious, did the agent that you were friends with that William Morris, did she end up being your agent? Did she end up helping you break into the business, or was that more of just she did? So you said you had this first script you got into development. How many scripts had you written when you got this first script into development?
One. It was my first script.
Okay, and so you were able to, and you got that to her, and she liked it enough, she sent it out, and it garnered enough interest to kind of get things rolling.
Well, that one that one actually didn't go anywhere, but it opened the door. I had another couple of ideas, and what that script did was people read it, they liked it, and the next question is, and what they would say was, well, but this is, we like it, we like the writing. This is not a script that we want to do, but what else you got? And so then I would pitch, another idea that I had, and that's that's really the one that got into development, was the next idea. But it was the first script that, got me in the door. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that as a beginning writer or as a writer that you have to learn how to do is, when you walk into the room, is you have to take over the room. And it's hard. If you're not an outgoing personality, that can be challenging. But the more you can walk into the room and be a performer for that 15 minutes, half an hour, the more energy and even the way that you sit in a chair is important. If you sit back in a chair, the energy is different. Which is why I always mentor the writers I talk to. When you go into whether you're pitching something or even just having a meet and greet, don't sit back. Sit towards towards the edge of the chair, so that really there's a certain feeling in the room that at any moment you could spring like a jungle cat across the table. So that, and it just creates it's a different energy. And unfortunately, the perception of writers in this business, in the feature world, it's very different in the TV world, but in the feature world, is that a writer is a necessary evil. And so, there was that Jack Warner used to walk around the Warner Brothers lot listening at the writers' building. He wanted to make sure that all the Underwood typewriters were being used. He referred to writers, to screenwriters as schmucks with Underwoods. and to a degree, I don't think that attitude towards writers has changed all that much. We're incredibly expendable. But
so how did you make your sort of leap into horror? You said your first script was a comedy. Then how did you because it seems like a good number of your credits are sort of more in the horror genre. How did you get into that genre?
Horror was where the money was, and I always saw Tales from the Crypt as dark comedy, And I was always a big fan of the EC Comics when I was growing up. And when I was very lucky in that my partner, was a very strong producer. He had worked another show for HBO called The Hitchhiker, and this goes back a long, long time. And HBO really wanted Gil, a guy named Gil Adler was my partner. They really wanted Gil, and Gil and I had been working together, and Gil really wanted to bring me in. And Gil said when they wanted us to do Tales from the Crypt, I had written episodes for a show called Freddy's Nightmares. I had done an interesting reality show pilot called, I think it was called Haunted Lives. HBO was ambivalent about me, but Gil, fortunately, again, it's relationships, and Gil was, he said, no, trust me, you got to have this guy. He's really smart. You're going to be happy with him.
How did you get onto Freddy's Nightmares? Was that again writing like a horror spec TV pilot?
In that case, again, because the first script that I put into development was with Gil. Gil had read the first script that I ever wrote and said, "This is great." And part of he approached me while we were working on the script that he got the financing for. He said, we should write together. And I, having really never written with anyone before, but I was open to it. And, it didn't seem like a bad thing to do. And one of the first lessons that I learned is that actually to write with a partner is great because, first of all, especially if it's a good relationship, the sum is greater than the parts. And there's a strange thing that goes on where, first of all, you feel obligated to always bring your best because you don't want to let that other person down. At least that's the way that I always was. So I liked having Gil as a partner, and it seemed to be just a good way to go. So Gil was hired to produce Freddy's Nightmares, and one of the things that he said was, well, I want my partner, as part of my deal, I want my partner to write a couple of scripts. And they said, well, okay. So again, it was a degree of good fortune.
So I guess the question is, how did you meet Gil? That would be maybe an interesting story because it sounds like he was certainly instrumental in kind of getting you into the business.
I had written I'd written this a screenplay called Down to Earth, which is about a cynical kid who calls a late-night Art Bell kind of talk show just to make fun of some guy who's talking about his encounter with aliens, and somehow he manages to say just enough stuff that sounds right that he suddenly attracts a lot of attention to himself. And lo and behold, he has stumbled into a world where all kinds of bizarre things are happening to him. And it was a comedy, and Gil read it and liked it, and he wasn't really that into doing that, but I pitched him another idea about a guy who he helps this young French woman get her green card. And they have this relationship all of a sudden. And this was before there was a movie called, I think it was called Green Card, which came out. I had done my version. I think it was called French Kiss. I had done it about 5 years before Green Card came out, and we just never managed to get it, to get it produced before then. But Gil set French Kiss into motion, and he had heard my pitch for that, liked my first script, liked the pitch for that, and said, we got to work together. So that's what to a degree, that's where a screenplay is, as I said, it's a sales tool, not just for the thing itself, but ideally you got to think about a screenplay as a sales tool for you.
Just in terms of getting you other work, not just in terms of actually selling that script.
Exactly right. So the more that you can make that screenplay a great, not just a great piece of work, but a great calling card, a great sales tool. It's very, very important so that they can see that, one, you know how to tell a story. You know how to write characters that are memorable and compelling and fun and leap off the page, that as I said, you know how to tell a story, but that you know how to tell a story within the idiom of film, that you understand storytelling from a cinematic point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a huge difference in either getting the screenplay, sold or optioned, and in getting additional work from the screenplay. As I said, if it gets you into a room where someone says, this is good, I don't know if I want to do that, but what else you got? First of all, then you got to have other things, some other arrows in your quiver, and you've got to have the ability to then walk in and sell them or pitch them quickly, elegantly, entertainingly. And that's also, part of how to succeed, how to make it, how to
Sure.
break in.
So let's take a step back, and we had mentioned before the interview, possibly talking about Breaking Bad. Let's kind of what are some common mistakes you see with screenwriters, and what are some lessons we can learn from something like Breaking Bad? I mean, certainly Breaking Bad got a lot of critical acclaim. The writing is considered excellent. So maybe you can give us a quick little lesson on some of the things you saw Breaking Bad do that you thought were really, really good.
Breaking Bad epitomizes great characters, and great characters make great storytelling. The thing that TV, in terms of as a learning tool, TV, a successful TV show, is all about characters and characters that people will want to bring into their living room, or that was in the old days into the living room. Now, whatever the viewing device is, that people are going to want to spend a considerable amount of time with, who they're going to care about over the course of dozens of episodes, one hopes. So the key is in investing everything into great, conflicted, compelling characters. And one of the things that it takes a while to figure out how to do, and I think a lot of starting writers they don't go deeply enough into the meat and the gristle and everything below the surface of their characters. So therefore, the conflicts between the characters are always up on the surface. In Breaking Bad, you had first of all, a phenomenal character in Walter White. And Walter was an angry man who felt he had been cheated. He had the company that he should have been part of, that should have made his fortune, that should have really validated him as not just a scientist, but also as a man. It never happens. And this festering wound sits inside of him. And, of course, then he gets cancer. And in a way, the cancer is somewhat metaphorical for the thing that is inside of him. But again, it's important to have that bit of inner anger. And then you've got to find all the different ways for that to play out. Now, when Walter then, in an act of sheer desperation, turns to making meth, he's a proud character. And he's not just out to make meth, he's out to make the best meth. As contradictory as that should be, he's doing a really a terrible thing, but he's not approaching it that way. And in part, there's a little bit of a sociopath inside of him because he's so angry. But it is the depths of that anger and the righteousness of that anger that makes everything else work and allows him to be, even though he's doing this terrible thing. And the remarkable thing about Walter White is that he did a lot of terrible things, and yet we still wanted to know what was going to happen to Walter. Now, then, of course, you have to surround him with characters with whom there are going to be natural, compelling, real conflict. And, of course, there was his partner in Jesse. And Jesse was so antithetical initially, and yet one of the keys to making the Jesse character work and making the conflict with Walter become more and more compelling was that Jesse, for all of his inadequacy and he's a failure, is tremendously innocent. Down deep, there was a goodness to Jesse that ultimately, as Breaking Bad went on, especially into the last couple seasons, his natural his natural goodness and Walter's cravenness became a great counterpoint. And then, of course, against that you have his brother-in-law, who's a DEA agent and a good, as straight and narrow as there could possibly be, for whom the world is black and it's white, and that is just how it is. And he sees anyone who does what he ultimately learns his brother-in-law is doing is deserving of nothing less than total destruction at all costs, and everything else be damned. And then, of course, you surround Walter with characters who live in the gray world. His wife, who is willing to compromise when she suddenly realizes what this is about. And it's a terrible, painful compromise. You also have the brother-in-law, the wife's sister, who goes to a gray place when she accepts money for, when the husband when the brother-in-law, when Hank gets wounded and she accepts money for his health care. A terrible compromise. But again, this is where, the great realistic, compelling drama comes from. Great characters, great character depth. And then when you push them up against each other, you can twist it and turn it any number of ways, and it's incredibly believable, and it's compelling. And that's really, from the moment you first type fade in, you've got to have a lot of that character work already figured out. You have to know, and really what that involves, it's the hardest thing for any writer, experienced or inexperienced. It's you sit down and you begin to ask yourself a series of questions. And it's why? Why are they like that? Why would they do that? And, writers, we tend to be lazy. Because of this simple reason. All right. Mm-hmm. It would be easy enough just to let that go, because to ask, well, but why? Requires an awful lot of hard work to get to the bottom of. And that's really where the hardest work in the writing process is. It is to dig as deeply as you possibly can so that you know everything, so that the why is not, it might be a simple reason, but no one does anything for simple reasons, where good dramatic characters need to be complex and compelling. And in order to make that work, they have to have all kinds of problems and issues and doubts and flaws and faults, because that's what makes interesting characters.
Did you? And I've never heard anybody say this, but did you ever think that they went a little bit too far? It was pretty early on in the series, but he effectively killed Jesse's girlfriend. Remember when they were doing drugs, and he effectively murdered. And
yes, he did. But
and there were some moments like that I felt, geez, this is even for him, it's I don't have any sympathy. I felt like too. I totally agree with the assessment that at the foundation of this is great characters. I found some of the episodes a little uneven. There was one episode where they're trying to kill a fly inside their little meth lab, and I found that very tedious. And so there's some of those like that, but there were some other episodes that I thought were just, aside from the great character writing, they were just well written episodes. The scene where the brother-in-law gets shot, it was an incredibly it was a very cinematic episode where the bad guys come in, they're chasing down Walt, they get put onto this other guy. There's the setup with the bullet that, the guy flips the bullet in the truck and the bad guy catches it and then drops it, and then the brother-in-law is able to put the one bullet back into the chamber to effectively save his life. So there were some episodes that I just found incredibly riveting, and even late in the series where the characters were already well established.
Right. But that's what great characters will do. They can do. It's in the details, and it's those details that are absolutely spot on to who they are. And where Walt White was concerned in killing the girlfriend, he was very clear on where his priorities were. and no one was going to screw with his priorities. And so, a terrible, dark moment. And yet, it's not that you didn't believe him. Did it make him less empathetic? Well, yeah. But it didn't make you turn off from the show.
Mm-hmm.
I think, if anything, it made him even more compelling because he just became more and more real. And his reality was, my situation, I will preserve it at all costs. Don't screw with what I have. The scene when Hank gets killed out in the desert, I thought that episode was just breathtaking in its. And again, it was not what Jesse, it was not what Walt intended to happen, but it was at times out of his control because he was playing in a world where, it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the scene out in the desert when he meets up with those people who are going to be his partner, and he says, "Say my name," I think really spoke to the arrogance, but from his point of view, the righteous arrogance of what he had accomplished and how far he was willing to go. And this was a moment of absolute success. He had taken down a drug lord, and he had done it because he was smarter than a really smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
And
so, is there any tips that we could maybe just take a step back and get some concrete tips that writers could kind of take away? Like, I totally agree with sort of your assessment of how great these characters were. Another character you didn't mention, which was great, was the lawyer. Was humorous. So, it was riddled with great moments and great characters. But is there some way that, new writers can, or not even new writers, any writers, is there some sort of method that you know of that maybe could help them create these sorts of, dimensional characters? And as you said, another point, which I think is very, very important, is not just creating deep characters, it's creating them and then, each character brings out sort of the best or worst, depending on your point of view. But each character is in sort of conflict with the other one. If the Aaron Paul character had been more ambitious, then he would have been too much like Walter, and you would have lost a lot of the conflict between them. And as you say, if the brother-in-law had not been such a black and white, you would have lost a lot of the potential conflict between Walt. So it's not just a matter of creating those characters; it's a matter of then you create, I guess, one main character, but then you have to create the proper characters to play against them. Again, is there some tips or some ways that maybe writers could figure that out or work on that?
Sometimes you can even, if you really just observe reality, because we're surrounded with these things all the time. If you just read the newspaper, the conflict that goes on that's going on at present in Washington D.C. between Obama and Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, and a guy like John Boehner who was trying to navigate his way through his own, every other year he's got to get reelected. He's got to deal with the Tea Party crowd who are extremely right wing, and if he pisses them off, they're gonna screw him over. And yet he is trying to navigate these very difficult waters. Here in reality is a great template for how great drama works, because really it's just look at how reality is, and look at even in your own life. We walk through situations where we just want to go along to get along, but there's always something that's going to be interfering with a peaceful, easy existence. And if you really just give it a good solid look, you can see all the conflict that's in your own daily life. Take note of it. Look at how it works. Understand the mechanisms for how frequently we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, and that's drama. What are you going to do when you got to get money to pay the rent or the mortgage, and you don't have enough? What are you going to do? How are you going to solve that problem? And that's really where that also is the nature of drama. It's a problem that must get solved. Find the most compelling problem and pit two characters with competing needs in terms of that problem, and now you've got a story. So it really is, you have to look deeper than you think you have to look. Because really there's more going on. It's getting down to the finer points, to the details is really where, and again, it's just be willing to go deeper into what is causing the conflict that interested you in the story to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's excellent advice, and I think people all writers should be really observing what they're seeing in their everyday lives and trying to implement that and put that into their stories. I wonder if we could just kind of close on just some maybe general tips for people that are trying to break into business. I mean, business tips, maybe just a few tips, writing tips. Just anything really to kind of help people get started. I hear from a lot of writers that, especially writers now with the internet, there's so many people that are not in LA trying to break in, and they can listen to the podcast and they can read my blog and get in touch with me. And, what kind of things should they be doing? If you're not in LA, you're not in the scene, how can we help those people improve their writing and, as I said, maybe even some business advice, how they could actually get their script read?
One of the ways that if they approach script writing especially, they've got to find their inner Hemingway. Screenplay writing really has got to be as stripped down as you can possibly make it. Think of each page. You've got to try to approximate the movie watching process as you write. It is absolutely allowed that if you can. It's almost like the equivalent of scat singing, where you're just hitting the notes. You're creating the sound, the image that it's really you're stringing together in terms of the images. It really is a less is more. Try to pare down not only the language and the way that you use the language. Find the most effective ways to communicate the tension in a scene, just the essentials of what we need to see. And what a lot of young writers, what a lot of starting writers do is they fill up a page with too many words in essence. And so from the point of view of the reader, as you look at the page, you see these big gloppy, paragraphs, action paragraphs that are 5, 6, 7 lines long, and it doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like I'm reading a novel here. Mm-hmm. The more you can make that,
and reading, especially in this day and age, reading other screenplays. It's easy to find screenplays online. So that's my first. I totally agree, and that's you'd be real wise to just read a lot of screenplays to see sort of the fundamentals of how the things and just exactly what you're saying. After you've been around the business for a while, you can kind of just leaf through a screenplay, and I bet 98% of the time you can tell if that screenplay is going to be good, literally just by leafing through it and see how the words are laid out on the page.
Really, and you know it in the first 2-3 pages.
Mm-hmm.
You just know it, and it's the very, very, very rare screenplay that upends your expectations. So
how did you get how did you get some of these fundamentals down? You said you just wrote this first script and gave it to your friend at William Morris. How did you get some of these fundamentals? Had you read a script? Did you read a book on screenwriting?
The book that opened my eyes and okay, I think I get this, was William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade. which included, as in the book, the screenplay for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now, Butch Cassidy is not, and again, yes, structure is very important, and I believe very, very deeply in structure in general, but you don't have to be a prisoner to structure, because sometimes if you go and you break the rules and you do it elegantly and you do it smartly, you will succeed for having broken the rules. And wow, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as a great piece of writing, breaks every last rule. It is not a 3-act structure. It's just two characters discovering how out of place in their world they are. And tremendous, because it's a chase through really half the movie is a chase. Mm-hmm. Done,
in terms of formatting, in terms of formatting and stuff, though, that's literally what you did. You looked at that screenplay and then just wrote your screenplay in a similar format.
Yes, yeah, and just I was also very lucky. When I was in college, I had a great dramatic literature professor who did a lecture on Ibsen's Ghosts, which was magnificent, and that really was as an introduction to how to tell a dramatic story. It was phenomenal, and that also was very that had a great impact on me, and again, it had to do with characters. And in Ghosts, it's this woman, Mrs. Alving, has a son. She's divorced from her husband. Her son Oswald is in his early 20s. He's coming home to die. He has syphilis. Now he acquired syphilis through his father. It was, and again, one of the themes in the play is the sins of the father. And Oswald has come home to die, and it's an incredibly heart-wrenching tragedy. And the conflict that Mrs. Alving has as she begins to realize that in fact her son is dying. It's just a great character-rich story. And you get to the ending and he's dying and he says, "Oh, Mother, look, the sun is setting. Isn't it beautiful?" And of course, the sun is literally and figuratively setting. He's dying right there in front of her, and it just rips your heart out. But it's brilliant storytelling. So that also, helped. Again, it's characters.
Mm-hmm. And I think that would be wise advice too, is going for newer writers, or really any writers. And I read a lot of Ibsen back when I was first starting out, but I have forgotten some of the stories. But everybody should go back and read some of those classics. I mean, certainly Shakespeare, but Ibsen is very easy to read because it's all about sort of his structure, setup, and his characters. Shakespeare's a little more difficult.
Harder. It's denser language, but there's there are a couple of Ibsen's plays, Ghosts, The Dollhouse.
The Wild Duck was one that I read and liked.
Wow, yeah, indeed.
So, yeah.
Yes, and there's a lot to be taken because these things. There's a reason why they're still performed today, and not just because they're old and respected, but because they did something remarkable. And again, it comes down to great characters, great conflict, and therefore a great story.
Mm-hmm. So, well, let's end on that note. I think that's a good way to go out. Alan, I really appreciate your time. This has been very helpful, and hopefully people that are listening can get a lot out of it.
I hope so too, and I think we can. I think part of the goal is to make everyone great storytellers, because everyone's got a great story in them. Some people have several great stories in them, and it's just a matter of teaching them how to tell those stories the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, thank you again, Alan.
Pleasure was mine, Ashley.
A couple of quick notes. One of the things that impresses me about Alan is his deep understanding of how screenplays work, and that comes from working in the business for years, but also reading great plays like Ibsen's Ghosts. If you haven't read any Ibsen plays, I highly recommend you do so. Anyway, I know I learned a lot talking to him, so hopefully you did too. Alan has been gracious enough to offer his services to the Selling Your Screenplay community as a screenplay consultant. So if you'd like to get some feedback on your screenplay from Alan, just check out sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultant. You'll see Alan's bio and his current prices on that page. In this week's Writing Words section, I want to continue on with some of the things I talked about in Episode 3. In Episode 3, I asked listeners to email me if they felt they had done all the steps that I talked about and still hadn't found any success. There was some very specific criteria that I laid out, so please go back and listen to that episode if you haven't heard it. But in any event, I got an email from a guy who had been pretty aggressive with his marketing efforts, but was still struggling. But when I drilled into exactly what he was doing, it did appear as though he was making a few mistakes, which I'll talk about in a minute. He's got the persistence down, and that's very, very important. To be persistent counts for a lot. So if he can make some subtle adjustments, I think he can break through. His actual story concept was pretty good too, so he's got quite a bit going for him. But here's the main takeaways from the email exchange that I had with him. There's that famous Einstein quote, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." If you keep doing something over and over again and it's not working, you've got to adjust and try other things. On the very first podcast episode, I talked about a story of the kid in the karate class. He was trying to karate chop through some boards with his bare hands, but he couldn't do it. When the instructor came over, he saw the problem. The instructor simply turned the boards 90 degrees so that he could chop with the grain. And sure enough, on the next chop, he punched right through. Being smart and adjusting is definitely a part of this process. If things aren't working, you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So here's some good news. When you're submitting cold query letters, there's really only two variables. First, you need to have enough volume to really know if what you're doing is working or not. And the second variable is, of course, your actual query letter. So let's talk about volume for a second. I would say you need a list of at least 1,000 companies. That's 1,000 different production companies or 1,000 different producers. I'm not saying to send out the same letter to the same 100 companies 10 times. You need a list with 1,000 unique producers on it. Keep in mind, my list has over 5,000 producers in it, and I'm sure that I don't have every producer in the world in my database, so there's almost no limit to how big a list you can create, and the bigger, the better. So what you want to do is just start testing out your query letter to 200 producers. I would say if you don't get at least a script request or two from those 200 producers, you probably need to go back and rewrite your query letter and logline. Just keep doing this over and over again, changing your logline and query letter and then blasting it out to another 200 producers. And you've really got to rewrite the hell out of it, not just make a few small tweaks. I've seen some pretty unmarketable concepts get some script requests, so at this stage, I think even a terrible concept can work if the logline and query letter are well written. And when I say it can work, I mean you can get script requests. It may not end up in a script sale or a script option if your concept is terrible, but you can get some script requests even with an unmarketable concept. Once you've got things working and you're getting a few script requests, then you can scale things up and hit your entire list with your query letter. And even better, you can go out and really try to build an even bigger list. It really is that simple. But as I said, if things aren't working, you really need to take a step back and make adjustments. And sometimes this means huge adjustments. Now, the next big question, of course, is once you get this cold query letter part of the process down, what happens when no one is optioning your screenplays? Now you're getting the script request, but you're not getting any true interest in the material. I think it's basically the same problem. It's time to make adjustments. Maybe your scripts aren't quite up to professional standards, or maybe if you're writing quirky comedies, it's time to write a thriller. Don't be too proud to take a real hard look at your material. When you think your material is good enough, that's when you stop improving, and that's the death of any writer at any level. If things aren't working, don't be afraid of making huge sweeping adjustments. As always, if you have any questions about how to write a good query letter and logline or how to go about building an email list like the one I'm talking about in this podcast, please do sign up for my free guide at sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It explains all of this in great detail. Anyway, that's this week's episode. Thanks for listening.